The auction barn had gone quiet in a way that August afternoons in that valley never went quiet, and everyone under that tin roof knew it. 200 people, maybe more, pressed into the folding chairs and along the rails. And not one of them was fanning himself now, though the heat sat on the crowd like a wet wool blanket. At the front of the room, beneath a hand-lettered banner for the county fair's championship futurity, stood a woman named Cora Halverson, with her hat in her hand and dust in the creases of her knuckles, and in the pen behind her stood a black heifer, whose bloodline every breeder in 3 counties had by then learned to covet. The man in the pressed gray suit had just named his number, and the number was enough to buy every acre Cora owned twice over, and the crowd waited to hear what she would say. She did not answer him right away. She looked out over the faces of the people who had laughed at her 4 years back, and she let the silence do what silence does. What none of them understood, yet what they would understand before the day was through, was that the real verdict had already been passed long ago, not by any of them, and not by the man in the gray suit, but by the ground itself, and by an old woman who had told her a true thing on a cold morning a lifetime of seasons before. To understand what Cora said next, you have to go back to the beginning, back to the day she paid $35 for a calf nobody else would bid on. She had come to the valley with a truck that burned oil, a dog that had already died on the road east of the mountains, and $1,140 folded into an envelope inside her coat. That was the whole of it. That was every dollar she had, after the little house in the city sold, and the lawyers took their portion, and the last of her father's debts were settled, and $1,140 is not a fortune anywhere, and it was less than that in a place where good bottom land ran 400 an acre and a sound-bred cow. Ring. The property she bought was 160 acres of what the county assessor had honestly listed as marginal grazing, up against the north slope where the good creek petered out into a seep, and it came with a leaning barn, a well that gave water the color of weak tea, and a price of $900 because no man with sense wanted it. That left her $240 to live on and to stock the place, and she did the arithmetic the way she would learn to do it. Every night for years after laying the numbers out flat on the kitchen table like a hand of cards she was losing. $240 against a winter. A dollar wouldn't stretch to what a cow cost. So she went to the sale, not to buy a cow at all, but to see what a person could get for pocket change, and what a person could get for pocket change was the calf nobody bid on. They ran it in near the end of the day, when the good stock had long since sold and the crowd had thinned to the loafers and the buyers filling out loads. It was a heifer calf, black as a stove lid, undersized, with a runny eye and a rough coat, and a mother that had died of milk fever in the spring, which meant the little thing had been bucket raised badly by a man who resented the labor. The auctioneer looked at his card and looked at the calf and gave a short laugh that told the room everything about what he thought of it. Somebody hollered that they ought to just knock it in the head and save the freight. Somebody else said, give it away with a sack of feed. The bidding did not so much begin as fail to begin. The auctioneer called for $1 and got nothing, called for 50 cents and got a chuckle. And it was into that emptiness that Cora Halverson, who had never in her life bought a living animal, lifted one finger and said $35, in a voice that did not carry so much as arrive. The barn turned to look at her. A tall, red-faced man near the front, a prosperous cattleman named Del Brunner, who ran 400 head on the finest grass in the valley, and never let anyone forget the number, threw back his head and laughed until his neighbors laughed with him, and he said loud enough for the rafters, "Well, boys, there's a fool and her money. And the money won't be lonesome long." The gavel came down. The calf was hers. She let it out on a length of clothesline because she could not afford a halter, and it fought her the whole way to the truck, and it soiled the seat, and it balled the entire drive up the washboard road to her leaning barn. And she named it nothing at all that first week, because she was half certain it would die. It did not die. It stood in her sorry pen and looked at her with its one clear eye and its one runny one. And when she carried it warmed milk and a mash she'd read about in a borrowed pamphlet, it drank, and then it butted the empty bucket and looked at her again as if to say the arithmetic wasn't finished. That was the first sign of hope. And she would not have called it that at the time. She would only have said, the calf had an appetite. But an appetite is a promise a body makes to the future. And she was a woman who kept her promises, and so she began to keep the calves. The first winter nearly finished them both. She sold the good tires off her truck and ran it on bald ones to buy hay, and when the hay ran short, she cut wild grass along the seep with a scythe she'd found rusting in the barn, learning the swing of it by the ache in her shoulders. She ate beans and cornmeal and the eggs from 4 hens she'd traded a day's labor for, and she lost weight she could not spare. And there were nights she sat at that kitchen table with the numbers laid out and could not make them come to anything but ruin. $1,140 had become, by the coldest week of January, $41 and some coins in a coffee can. And $41 is not a wall against anything. The town, when she went in for salt and flour, had a way of looking at her that she came to know. They called her the widow. Up the north slope, though she had never been married. And behind that, they called her, when they thought she couldn't hear, and sometimes, when they knew she could, the girl who bought Brunner's laugh. A woman alone, they said, up on that dead ground with the runt out of a dead cow. And they said it the way you'd remark on weather that was bound to turn bad. She heard it and she did not answer it, because she had already begun to learn the thing she would build her whole life on, which was that being right is a slow answer, but it is the only one that ever holds. It was in that first deep winter that the old woman came. Cora had seen her from a distance, a neighbor on the adjoining quarter section, a widow herself named Ingrid Selvig, who had come over from the old country as a girl 50 years before, and farmed her rocky acres alone, with a stubbornness the valley respected and feared in equal measure. People said she could tell weather 3 days out, and that she talked to her animals, and that once she had refused to sell her good bull to Del Brunner's own father, for reasons she never explained. She walked up the washboard road one gray morning with the burlap sack over her shoulder, and she did not knock so much as appear at the pen rail. And she looked a long while at the black heifer calf that had by then grown gaunt but bright-eyed, and she did not laugh. That was the first thing Cora noticed. In all the valley, this was the first grown person who had looked at the calf and not laughed. "You have got a good one there," the old woman said at last, in her soft cadenced accent that turned the ends of words up like the corners of a smile. Cora, who had heard nothing but the opposite for months, said carefully that most folks thought otherwise. Most folks, Ingrid Solvik said, look at the calf. They do not look at the mother's mother. And she leaned on the rail and told Cora what no man at that sale had bothered to know or say, which was that the dead cow, the milk fever cow that had thrown this runt and died, had been the last daughter of a line the old woman remembered from 30 years back, a line of small, hardy black cattle brought into the valley by a family long since broken up and scattered, cattle that were never big and never pretty and never won a ribbon, because ribbons in those days went to the tall and the fat. But cattle that could turn poor grass into good beef and breed back every single year without fail and calve without help and never lose their feet on a hard hill. The look was in this one, she said. The runny eye was nothing. A matter of dust and a poor start, it would clear. The size was nothing. The little ones grew slow and grew right. Then she said the thing that Cora would carry to the end of her days. The thing she would repeat to herself on the hard nights and say aloud at the last. The land remembers what the farmer forgets, the old woman said, and the good blood does the same. It only whispers, so you must be quiet enough to hear it. And she reached into the burlap sack and drew out a proper leather halter, worn soft with years, and laid it over the rail and said, "A clothesline is for a fool, and you are not a fool no matter what they say in town, and then she turned and walked back down the washboard road and did not look back. Cora named the calf that night. She named her Whisper for the word the old woman had used, and the naming changed the arithmetic in a way no number could, because a thing with a name is a thing you intend to keep. Through the rest of that winter, she did what Ingrid Solvik told her, which mostly came down to being quiet and paying attention. She learned that the seep the county called worthless gave water year-round, when the good creek froze, and that the north slope her neighbors scorned held the winter's sun and grew a wiry native grass that Whisper preferred to hay. She stopped fighting the ground and started watching it. And in the spring the runny eye cleared just as the old woman had promised, and Whisper shed her rough coat and came out sleek and small and sound. And though she was still the least impressive animal on any road in the valley, Cora had begun to see what Ingrid had seen, and she guarded that seeing like a coal banked low under the ash, giving off no light, but holding all its heat, waiting. The child came the second summer. He was a thin, watchful boy of about 10, named Petey Lund, whose father drank the family's rent money and whose mother took in washing, and he started appearing at Cora's fence the way stray dogs appear from nowhere, and then always. He did not talk much, and he did not mock, and one hot afternoon he climbed through the wire and took up a shovel without being asked and mucked the pen clean, and Cora fed him supper, and it became a thing that happened. Petey named the calves as they came, for by then Whisper had been bred to a borrowed bull of the same old blood, and had thrown a heifer as small and sound as herself, and the next year another. And Petey named them all, and a name stuck. He was the second person in the valley who saw sense in what she was doing. And between the old woman and the silent boy she was, for the first time since she'd buried her dog on the road east of the mountains, not entirely alone. She built her little herd the slow way, the only way she could afford, which was to let the good blood do what its nature intended. She kept every heifer and sold only the steers, and she sold those not fat and young the way the valley did, but grown out on grass to a firm and marbled beef that cost her almost nothing to make, because the animals foraged the slope her neighbors couldn't use. The town still pitied her. Del Brunner, when he passed her on the road, still tipped his hat with a grin that was all teeth. And once at the feed store, he told the men that the widow's little black dwarfs were the joke that kept on giving, and the men laughed because Del was prosperous, and a prosperous man's jokes are always funny. Cora heard it. She had by then 11 head, where she'd started with 1, and a herd sire of her own raising named Solvik's boy after the old woman. And she had begun to notice something at the fair and the sales she could not yet afford to enter, which was that the tall, fat cattle everyone bred for had started to falter. They needed rich feed. The valley bought on credit. They calved hard and lost calves. They cost more every year to keep, and she kept quiet about it and banked her coal and waited. The first real vindication came from outside, the way it does, because a prophet is never believed at home. A cattle buyer named Amos Trent drove up from the packing operation 2 counties south, a blunt man who bought on quality and cared nothing for reputation, and he stopped at Cora's fence not knowing whose it was, and looked a long while at her grass-grown steers. He put his hands on one and felt along its back and its ribs the way a doctor reads a body, and then he named a price per pound that was nearly double the going rate, and when Cora, keeping her voice level though her heart was going, asked him why, he said the truth she had been waiting 4 years to hear from a stranger's mouth. "Because this is beef, ma'am," he said, "and most of what I buy is just weight." That check, when it cleared, was more money than she had held since the day the little house in the city sold, and she did not spend it. She entered the fair. She entered Whisper's granddaughter, a small, flawless black heifer named Juniper that Petey had named for the tree by the seep in the futurity that fall, and the valley laughed to see the widow's dwarf led into a ring of tall, fat show cattle, and then the valley stopped laughing. Because the judge that year was a man from the state college who had spent his life studying what actually made a beef animal. And he walked past the tall, fat cattle, and he ran his hands over Juniper, and he stood her at the top of the class, and gave a short speech about correctness and function and the future of the breed that half the crowd didn't understand, and the other half understood too well. Juniper took the championship. She took it again the next year, and Solveig's boy sired the calf that took it in the county over, and word moved the way word does. Breeders who had left began to drive up the washboard road with checkbooks, wanting a heifer, wanting a straw of semen from the little black bull, wanting the blood the whole valley had once tried to knock in the head to save the freight. Cora sold carefully and kept the best, and the coffee can on the kitchen table gave way to an account at the bank in town, and the arithmetic that had once been a hand she was losing turned slowly, and then not slowly, into a hand she was winning. But she did not gloat, because the old woman had taught her that a coal that flares is a coal that dies, and she had learned to hold her heat. Then came the year the rains failed, and the failing of the rains was the crucible that the whole story had been building toward. It came on in the spring like the open door of a furnace, a dry wind out of the south that did not stop, and by June the good creek that the valley's prosperity was built on ran to gravel and stones, and the rich bottomland grass that the tall fat cattle needed curled and browned and gave up. The men who ran the big herds had bread for animals that could not live on little, and now there was little, and there was less every week. Del Brunner had 400 head in grass for 80, and the price of hay tripled, and then there was no hay at any price, and one by one, the great operations of the valley began to sell down their herds into a market so flooded with desperate cattle that a good cow brought less than Cora had paid for the runt at the sale. The valley was breaking, and on the north slope that everyone had scorned, the seep still ran because it always ran, and the wiry native grass that needed nothing still grew because it always grew, and Cora's small, hardy black cattle, bred for exactly this and nothing else, walked the hard hills on sound feet and turned the poor forage into good flesh and bred back and calved without help, just as an old woman had promised on a cold morning years before. She had grass, she had water. She had in a valley of dying herds, a living one, and she had the only bloodline in 3 counties that could be trusted to survive what was coming and pass that survival on. The arithmetic had inverted entirely. What she owned was now the one thing worth owning, and the men who had laughed knew it, and one of them came for it. He came in a pressed gray suit, and his name was Halloran, and he was the agent for a consortium of the big operators, Del Brunner, chief among them, that had seen at last what the widow up the north slope was sitting on. He was smooth, and he was warm, and he called her Miss Halverson, with a respect that had a hook in it, and he made her an offer for the whole herd and the bloodline entire. An offer with a great many zeros. And he framed it as a rescue, as the sensible thing, as the chance for a woman alone to finally be secure. Cora poured him coffee and listened, and told him no in a single quiet sentence, and his warmth cooled by a degree. He came back the next week with more zeros, and a subtle change in tone, a mention of how a herd was a fragile thing, how a well could be contested, how a woman alone up a bad road might find the valley an unfriendly place to a person who wouldn't be reasonable. That was the second wave, the veiled threat under the offer, and she told him no again. And then began the third and ugliest wave. The rumors sown careful and low, the whisper in town, that the widow was hoarding water that by rights belonged to the valley, that her cattle carried disease, that decent people were dying by inches, while she sat on her hill and gloated. The rumor had Del Brunner's fingerprints all over it, and it turned enough of the desperate and the frightened that Cora, going into town for the salt she still needed, felt the old cold looks come back, sharpened now into something meaner. But the drought that made her a target also made her indispensable, and the two things could not both stand. The first crack came when Del Brunner himself, the loud man who had bought her a name with his laugh some years before, drove up the washboard road alone one evening with his hat literally in his hands. He was thinner than she had ever seen him, and older by 10 years than his age, and his 400 head were down to 40, and those 40 were failing. and he stood in her yard and could not at first make the words come. Then he made them. He needed grass, and he needed water, and he needed, though it cost him more to say than any of it, some of her blood in his herd, if he was ever going to build back into a country that had changed under him for good. And he could not pay for it. Not the 10th of what it was worth. Not now. He had come to beg from the woman he had taught the whole valley to mock, and he stood there, braced for her to name a price that would break him, the way he had tried to break her, because that was what he would have done, and both of them knew it. Cora looked at him a long time in the failing light, and she thought about the arithmetic, all of it, the $1,140 and the $41 in the coffee can and the $35 for the calf nobody bid on. And she thought about what the old woman had said about being quiet enough to hear, and she made her choice. But she did not make it to him alone, in a yard where it would be his secret to spend as he liked. She told him to come to the fairgrounds, to the futurity sale, and to bring the whole valley, because what she had to say, she meant to say to all of them at once. And that is how it came to be that on that airless August afternoon, 200 people sat under the tin roof and did not fan themselves, waiting to hear what the widow of the North Slope would do with the power the dying land had put into her calloused hands. Halloran was there in his gray suit, and he had a plan. And the plan was to buy the herd out from under the desperation of the crowd, to stand up and offer his consortium's great sum in front of everyone, so that no valley man could compete, and to make of Cora's bloodline a private empire that would sell survival back to the broken at whatever price it liked. He rose when she was brought to the front, and he made his offer loud, the number with all its zeros, and he added, warm as ever, and certain he had won, that of course the herd was exactly what he'd valued it at all along, right down to the 63 head she was running on the slope, and the 14 bred heifers among them. And in the hush that followed his own words undid him, because Cora had never in her life told a single soul her count, had never posted it or sold it or spoken it, and there was only one way a man in a gray suit could know. She ran 63 head with 14 bred heifers, and that was by having someone up on her hill in the dark counting what was hers. She said it plainly into the quiet. 63 head? She said, 14 bred. You have a good eye for a man who's never once been on my land in daylight. Now, who told you, Mr. Halloran, or did you climb the fence yourself? And the barn understood all at once, and understood, too, the rumors and the whispers and the shape of the thing that had been done to a woman alone, and the warmth went out of the gray suit like heat out of a stone at dusk. Then Cora Halverson turned her back on the man and his zeros and spoke to the valley that had laughed at her. And she did not gloat, and she did not gouge, because a coal that flares is a coal that dies. She said she would not sell the herd, not to him, and not to any consortium, not for all the zeros in the state, because the blood in these cattle had come up out of this ground and been given her by an old woman who believed it should serve the valley and not one man's pocket. She said any breeder in the valley who wanted the blood could have a bred heifer or a straw from Solveig's boy at a price she named, and the price was so low the crowd murmured, low enough only to cover the labor and the feed and the keeping. Because, she said, the blood itself was never mine to sell. It was only mine to keep, and to pass on, the way it was passed to me. And she said the grass on the north slope, and the water in the seep, would be open to any neighbor who needed it while the drought held, and they would pay for it by the same measure, in labor, in a day's work, fixing the fence they grazed behind, and nothing more. The land, she said, remembers what the farmer forgets. It was time the valley remembered it too. The reversal came the way the old woman said the important things always came, in a whisper, and then all at once. Del Brunner was the first to take off his hat, and he held it against his chest, and he said in a broken voice, loud enough to carry that he had been a fool for years, and this woman had never once been the fool, and he had come to buy her mercy and been given it for free, and God forgive him. And then the hats came off, all across the barn, the loafers and the buyers, and the men who'd laughed, and Halloran of the gray suit stood alone in a room that had turned its back on him, and he gathered his papers and his zeros and walked out into the furnace heat, and the valley let him go without a word, defeated not by any weapon, but by a woman's plain decency, which is the only thing greed has never learned to buy. Cora sold her bred heifers that day at her low price to the men who had scorned her, and she signed her seep and her slope over to the valley's use for the price of a day's honest work. And the herd she kept, the core of the old blood, she kept. The rains broke that September, 3 days after the old woman told her they would. Ingrid Solvig walked up the washboard road one last time, older and slower, but with the same soft turn at the ends of her words. And she stood at the fence with Cora and the boy Petey, who was near grown now, and had a herd of his own coming from a heifer Cora had given him. And the three of them watched the water come back into the seep and the slope go green under the returning sky. And Whisper's great-granddaughter, a small black heifer as sound as her line had ever been, nosed a day-old calf to its feet in the wet grass. The old woman looked at the calf a long while, and she did not laugh, and she said the thing she had said on the cold morning years before, the thing Cora had carried through every hard night and every low arithmetic and every scornful look in town. "The land remembers what the farmer forgets," she said, "and the good blood does the same. It only whispers. And you, Cora Halverson, you were quiet enough to hear it." And Cora, who was no longer the widow up the north slope, nor the girl who bought Brunner's laugh, nor a woman alone, but simply a respected fixture of a valley that had learned better, stood in the green and the wet, with her calloused hands on the fence rail, and herded still. $35, she thought, for the calf nobody bid on. It was the finest arithmetic of her life, and it had never once been about the money.
But it was super fun though. I did have a great time. It's a slow fatty dino, that's why. Okay. I think Dino should do a Life is Strange live stream so we can cry our eyes out. Oh god, Maju. I have already played Life is Strange too. That was also really good. The problem is that like I play a lot of games, guys, and so most of these games I've already played. Like I've said this before, but like last year on my Steam recap, and this was just Steam by itself, which doesn't count like Nintendo or like PlayStation or anything like that. On Steam alone, I played and completed 72 games. I'm a bit cozy, everybody. Love me some Fallout. Oh, nice, Tectus. That's wild, yeah. And like, I play anything from like, Tectus, I play everything from like RPGs, JRPGs, FPSs, like, I play them all. Oh, thanks for the likes, Victoria. And thanks for the heart me, Katie. You're so sweet. Some read 72 books in a year. We finish games. Exactly. I will say, I don't read as many books as I wish I did anymore, but I do play an unbelievable amount of games. Okay.